Hello my friends, hope you are well. Today I'm back with the next installment in our Kitbashed 40k Swampiral Guard army, and I've made possibly the weirdest addition to our forces so far. Let's get into it.
Swamp Ramp Miniatures.
So here we have the big old mollusk slug thingy from the Herticular Slimax kit, and here we have a leftover bombast cannon from the field ordnance battery set. And my thinking for this build is basically just to merge these kits together into some kind of self-propelled slimy artillery platform that 1. Gives me another bombast cannon to field on the tabletop, and 2. Helps my army to look a bit more unique and weirder than it already does. And all in all, this was actually a really quick and relatively simple kitbash process, which I started by chopping off the tree up top here and part of this sprocket thing on the cannon. These adjustments allowed me to glue our cannon down into place and gave the miniature a really cool silhouette straight off the bat. I wanted to add the blast shield as well though, to give our green boys a bit of extra protection from incoming fire, so I added a couple of notches into the shell first to allow the shield to sit in a better position around the cannon, then secured it in place with a few generous squirts of super glue, which looked pretty good. And if you've seen any of the previous builds in this army so far, you know exactly what's coming next, because no purpose-made anti-projectile 3-inch thick metallic armor would be complete without a few planks of scrappy old swamp wood to reinforce it, so that's exactly what I'm doing to the front of this shield, using an initial layer of matchsticks and not being very precise, as I'll trim them all down in a moment. I also added a few cross-bracing planks made from coffee stirrers, attaching these at different angles over the matchsticks to give the wood a bit more of a layered and thrown together appearance, because swamp engineering is about as sophisticated as me sitting on my sofa eating chicken nuggets in my pants, average Friday night really, and when they were done I did my aforementioned wood trimming to get a more reasonable profile going on. That was already looking pretty good, but to add just a touch more interest, I added some chains around the bottom portions here to look like they're kind of holding everything together, then used some of my trademark sandwich bag ties to act as metal bracing pieces on the backside of the blast shield. The very final touches for the structure of the bombast cannon itself were to add some little matchsticks in the gaps between the shell and the supports, and this baby was looking pretty damn sweet now. Although it is just a cannon on the back of a weird mutated mollusk slug snail hybrid, aka your mum, it does have a kind of similar silhouette to an actual mechanized self-propelled artillery piece. So we're definitely hitting the brief of our army by maintaining the kind of sci-fi / traditional military appearance of the Imperial Guard with the addition of a distinctly swampy vibe. Good shit. Anyway, I thought that adding the tree back into the mix could make that silhouette look a bit more interesting and give our cannoneer a good vantage point to survey the battlefield. So I attached it at the back here, kind of angled off the breech of the cannon and using a wire pin to give it some extra support. This did leave a bit of a gap at the bottom, but I filled that in later with some green stuff, and overall I was really liking this addition. Next up, I needed to construct the actual miniature who will be operating the big old slimy cannon, and again you probably know the drill by now, just meshing together some Cadian and Gretchen pieces with a bit of green stuff to get the pose I want, which in this case would be a sit-in pose perched up on this branch with these offshoots as footrests. And since our Swampiral Guard operate on a size-based hierarchy where the smaller Gretchen and Snotlings get all the shit grunt work and the larger green boys get the more important combat roles, because larger size means larger brains, and larger brains means increased combat prowess, I've accordingly built up one of our more human-sized green boys to be responsible for this cutting-edge combat technology. I added a little cushion on top of the branch so he wouldn't get a spiky old bit of bark up his crack, and after I'd stuck him down I added a couple of pieces of wire to secure that cushion and make it look a bit more deliberately placed and less like a random blob. The Herticular Slimax kit also came with this little Nurgling tied up on a branch, and I decided to add him up front here, with the headcanon being that Nurglings are captured by the Swampiral Guard green boys and used as a last line of defense for anyone that gets too close. So he's basically just a tiny little berserker on a stick waiting to be unleashed into a melee. And he was the last proper addition I made to this build, so to get it completely ready for painting, I just went around filling any visible gaps on the shell and around the tree using some green stuff, and also mounted a couple of Snotlings that I'd be adding later, as it would feel basically criminal to do a Swampiral Guard build without them. So yeah, as I said, a relatively quick and easy kitbash for this one, but we've ended up with something really cool and unique looking, that also fits the lore of our army, with old Imperial Guard equipment being salvaged by the Green Boys and combined with their own swampy creatures and makeshift equipment. So I was feeling pretty pumped up about this and really excited to start throwing some paint around. I thought I'd make a start with the familiar elements of this miniature, being the areas we've already got a designated colour scheme for in the army, as I was still mulling over how to paint up the big old mollusk boy himself, so I just coloured in the different sections on the cannon, the tree, and our little green boy who's perched his cheeks up here on this branch, before moving on to all the metallic areas also. I then went around applying a variety of different washes to any areas that needed it, because I was feeling pretty lazy and couldn't be bothered to add shadows and depth in a more technical way. You know, me and this mollusk have a lot in common in that we're both slow moving slimy weirdos, so I'm doing my best to uphold that standard of behaviour. But once they've dried, I got to work finishing these little sections off quite quickly. The wooden areas got some quick sketchy highlights and some dry brushing, followed by a bit of glazing with a slightly bolder brown colour and a final splash of a dark green wash to make it look a bit more damp and swampy, while the bombast just got some quick and scratchy highlights along the purple edges and a bit of a rust effect paint that I also added onto the chains at the back here. For the tree, I just did a few layers of highlights with some different brown colours to pump up the contrast a bit, and for the final layer I did more of a stippling technique to add a bit more texture into the mix, doing the same thing for this pole holding our weaponized nurgling into place. This was a bit quick and dirty, but it'll do the job. And finally, for this section of painting, our green hero got the usual kind of highlights and finishing touches to help him stand out a bit more. And if you want to see the painting process for the soldiers in more detail, check out one of the previous Imperial Guard videos, and if not, then go and suck an egg. With those areas now done, I was on to the painting of our molluscoid creature, and I was feeling pretty clueless about this guy, to be honest, which is definitely reflected in my painting process, as it was all arse about it and just all over the place generally. The shell was my first struggle, and I thought a kind of dark teal base coat with a purple wash would give me a nice varied look, but that didn't really work how I hoped, so instead I went about adding a bunch of purple and pinky highlights onto the raised sections, being a bit more selective with these though, as I thought overdoing it would end up creating a quite uniform and boring look, which I wanted to avoid, as snail and animal shells usually have quite a natural and varied appearance. The brightest pink highlights especially were applied really sparingly, and I think this helped to build a nice level of contrast overall, so I was relatively happy with how this turned out. But I did feel like I'd lost basically all of my original blue colour in this process, and it was looking a bit more one note than I wanted. So I started glazing in some darker blues into the recesses and lower portions of the shell, before slowly adding some brighter blues into the mix for subsequent layers. The shell was looking way better after this process, but I felt like it just needed a tiny extra kick, so I used some nickel oxide to add one final burst of brightness into those blue areas, which in my opinion worked really well and sealed the deal on this shell for me, giving it an ever so slightly prismatic appearance like a shiny old Pokemon card.
Who's that Pokemon? It's
Artillery Snail Slimy Cannon Chumon. So now that the shell was done, I was onto the nice slimy fleshy portion of the molluscoid, and I got this kicked off by base coating the whole thing in a nice dirty mid-green colour, with my plan for this being to keep the top section something close to the original base coat and go for a much paler yellowy green colour for the little leggy undercarriage. But I was instantly kind of hating how that was looking, so I started glazing in some fleshy colours up top instead, which then turned into a full base coat at some point, and I followed this up with some paler fleshy highlights as well as some darker flesh coloured washes into the recessed areas, which helped to start adding in some depth and definition to this section. It wasn't looking as gross as I'd wanted though, so I used a kind of yellowy rotting flesh colour to push those highlights just a little bit further, and also add some little colour transitions in for areas like his eyeball stalks. And this looked way better than the previous green layer was on track for, because that was probably going to look like a crock of shite, so I was feeling okay about the last minute colour changes. I turned my attention back to the lower portion at this point, mixing in a pale bony colour to the nurgling green highlight I'd been using before, just to lighten those areas up and push the contrast with the top section a little bit further. Then I used some glistening blood effect paint to add some nice happy, gross, bloody colour on the little sores and knobbly bits of the flesh, making sure to add some streaks for wound seepage, and hit the tongue with this stuff as well. Those areas also got a bit of a fleshy wash to help add some definition, and I quite like the effect this gave to the flesh, so I use it as a bit of a glaze in some of the skin folds, and I used it quite heavily around the mouth to give those a bit more of a gross appearance. I added a little more blood in to refresh those sores, and at this point there wasn't a great deal of painting left. So I began wrapping everything up by giving him some nice orangey yellow eyeballs and his little stalky antenna things, finishing this off by dabbing a red wash around the edges. And this last little touch worked quite well for adding some extra definition between the eyelids and the eyeballs themselves, so I'll be trying this out again in the future. Then all that was left were the final few little details like the claws and the teeth, this little Venus flytrap thing, the scrap of cloth under the cannon, our close quarters self-defense system here, these lenses, an aquila, and of course our little snotling companions. And I was actually pretty happy with this paint job. It's not perfect and some of the colour choices are probably a little bit dubious, but as a whole I was satisfied, so it was time to base this baby up. There was one slight issue though, that the 100mm base I'd ordered for this build hadn't been delivered by the time I'd finished making it, but that's fine, I'll just stick it on the one that came with the particular Slimex for now. They're not a drastically different size, but they are a drastically different shape, so I'll definitely need to rebase this in the future if I want it to actually be game legal.
No.
But yeah, for now, I'm just adding our kind of usual swampy foliage stuff and what have you, adding a bit to our mobile snail artillery platform as well to help look like it's just crawled through a swamp at a blistering pace of 4 hours per mile. Then all that was left to do was add our little snotling boys into place and see how it came out. So there we have it, my friends. Definitely the most unique and weird unit I've added to my armies so far, but it's only the beginning of the weird things I'll be adding to it in the future. As a whole, I'm really pleased with how this came out. I've been going back and forth a little bit with the placement of our Nurgling on a stick. I'm kind of thinking now that it would have looked a bit better if I put it on the back of the snail shell instead, but I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about that, as it does make more sense to have it up front if it's supposed to be dropped off into a melee at a moment's notice. But equally, we are talking about a little green blob man who's traveling on a mollusk mounted artillery piece, so sense and reason don't necessarily need to be a big factor here. Either way though, I'm really happy with how it's come out, and I actually had a lot of fun painting it, even though I did do a lot of back and forth with my colour schemes for the mollusk. I think I've pushed myself a bit with some areas like the shell, which isn't perfect, but it's given me a lot of learning points and ideas that I can use in the future, so it was definitely worth it. But yes, good shit, my friends. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, then please subscribe or leave a like or a comment. Let me know what kind of weird swampy creature proxies I should add to my army next, and let me know what it smells like behind your ears. For now though, as always, I have been your friendly neighborhood swamp rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya.